Hey guys, I'm Jay Arrington from Greenbrier Studio, and in this video, I'm going to discuss my usual process for mixing drums and also share with you a trick to help bass guitar and kick drum blend well together. This particular song, I'm almost done mixing. It's by 10,000 Fathers and Grace Snellville in Georgia, produced by David Walker at the 10,000 Fathers studio, and it features singers Lauren Settembrini and Taylor Breen. And I'm going to play a little clip for you now. So before anything, I want to share some strategies before you even start mixing, and that one of the first things is to set a goal. You should hear a song in its raw state, or maybe if you're producing it, you should know kind of where you want the drums in particular to go before you start throwing on plugins and making moves. So I did that at the beginning of this song. I kind of had a vision for what I wanted the snare to sound like and the kick to sound like. But the most important thing is mix to serve the song that you're working on. I know I personally have a taste in what I want a kick drum EQ or a snare drum EQ to be like, but that doesn't work for every single song and every single genre. So be flexible in that and mix as much as you can in context and to serve the song that you're working on. In this particular song, I knew that there were going to be some samples added. I've got some percussion samples over here. So I knew that I was going to add some stuff, but I got the drums to sound as good as I could without samples to begin with. Let me go ahead and play the drums in solo in that section of the song. Okay, so another thing I want to discuss is routing and how I have everything set up. These are all the drum tracks here, and they are running to a drum bus, which is right here. And then beside the drum bus, I have a parallel compression bus. That's a big part of getting a thick, punchy sound that I'm usually going for, and these particular tracks are being sent to that parallel compression track. And then over here we have a room reverb track. I think it's a chamber, and a larger chamber that I called hall. Now let me talk about some other things that are good to have in place before you dive in really far into your mix. One of those things is monitor levels. A general rule is that if you can make the mix sound good at a low volume, then it will sound amazing at a louder volume. It also lets your ears last longer throughout the day when you're trying to mix a song for 8 hours. If you don't take breaks, you completely lose perspective. If you've ever worked for hours and hours at a time and you leave the studio and come back later, you might pull up your song that you were working on and think, what was I doing? This sounds horrible. I thought this sounded really good yesterday. That's not necessarily because you're not good at mixing. It's just because you're human and your ears need a break. So what I often do is take a 10-minute break almost every hour. I will set a timer for 45 or 50 minutes on my phone and then toss it to the back of the room so that I'm not tempted to scroll through Instagram when I get frustrated with a snare drum sound or something like that. And then when the alarm goes off, I'll take a break, and then I'll come back And usually I have some kind of aha moment right after that break. I'm like, oh, snare sounds a little bit weird, or the kick sounds a little bit weird. I'm going to make this little adjustment. So just take breaks, keep your perspective, and react to what you're hearing. And I think you'll get to where you want to go a lot faster, especially the more you practice this. Sort of along those lines, don't get stuck on one element in solo for too long. I can get a drum mix, which I usually start with in a song. I'll start with the drums, and I can get the drums to a place where I think it's going to be and where it's going to stay. But as soon as I get all the other elements of the song in the mix, inevitably I start making adjustments, and that's okay. That's actually good. The most important thing is the context of the entire song. So within the context of the drum mix, don't stay on a snare drum for 2 hours. Just do what you can. Try to keep moving. Take breaks. And I think you'll get to where you're wanting to go. Gain staging is important. You'll notice that I have most of my faders. I think this one's automated in this particular spot, but I try to keep the faders at 0 or unity. There are a few reasons for that. One is when you start dealing with sends up here, the level at which these sends put audio to another place is dependent upon where this fader is, unless you set it for pre-fader. That's another story I'm not really going to focus on, but it's just a good practice to keep these as close to 0 or unity as possible. And then when I'm sending to a bus, I shoot for somewhere around minus 15 dB on the meters here. Let's see how close I am to doing that. Somewhere around here. I'm a little bit hotter than that, but that's okay in this case. I try to shoot for somewhere around here for most of my levels when I'm mixing, and that is so that I don't get far into the mix and realize that I've completely run out of headroom over on the mix bus and I start clipping over here. That's never fun. You don't ever want to have to go back through and bring other faders down or try to figure out how you're going to not clip or peak over there. So just shoot for somewhere around there, mostly in the green and yellow, I think, on most DAWs. So let's see. With that said, the next huge thing I want to talk about is the importance of phase relationship or polarity. I don't know if you've ever, maybe you did spend a lot of time on a kick drum or a snare drum individually, and then you pulled in the overheads, and suddenly it sounded super thin and super weird and not at all what you wanted it to be. And you move the puzzle pieces around over and over and over and over again, and it just won't sound good. It sounds thin, or something just seems off about it. That's likely because of phase relationship and polarity. Long story short, what I like to do is start with overheads and then basically solo the overhead channel with each close mic individually and reverse the polarity or flip the phase, whatever you want to say, with this button here. It's the circle with the slash through it. If you see that on any plugin, that's what that's for. And I basically go through and I press that button in, and then I take it off, and I listen for which one sounds typically thicker or has more low end. Typically, whichever one sounds thicker, punchier, or has more low end, that's the way you want to go. So let me start with this overhead channel real quick. And before I do this, the next point is monitoring and mono when you're doing this phase stuff, because if you've got a pair of overheads and they're far left and far right, but then you have a snare drum that's in the center, it's hard to hear exactly what's happening But if you have a mono button on your monitor controller, maybe you don't. Another way to do it would just be to put these pan pots at 0 down the center. It puts everything down the center and forces you to listen dead center what the frequencies are doing and which one sounds better. So I'm also going to mute these reverbs real quick. Here's the overhead sound. Then I'm going to bring in the snare top. Now I'm going to flip this and then put it back. It might be really subtle, but it sounds better with this out. In actuality, I started with this plugin and did have it pushed in, but I used this EQ to reverse it just now for the example. So basically we've got the snare top and the overhead where they need to be in relationship. Where do I go from there? I'm going to switch over to the snare bottom here and play those together. Now I'm going to reverse the snare bottom and see what changes in the sound. Hopefully you can hear a change in thickness there too. In most cases, I don't think I've ever seen a case where this doesn't happen, but the snare top and the snare bottom should have, one of them should have the polarity reversed. It's just the nature of the way the drum is mic'd up. One is coming from the top, one's coming from the bottom. So if you've ever heard someone say the bottom is supposed to be flipped, that may not necessarily be the case. It may be that the top needs to be flipped and the bottom stay where it is. It does the same thing, but what's important is the relationship between these and the overheads. So then the next thing I would do would be checking the kick. I'm going to go ahead and put those back where they were and use my mono button on my controller here. I think it's a lot easier to hear on that one, but it gets really thin. That sounds better to me. And then I'll bring in I'll take that out and use the kick out. I have this reversed in the mix, but before it sounded like this. Suddenly all that low end just disappears. Much better. So at this point, you could do overhead and kick and snare mics. See where everything's sitting. Sometimes a weird thing happens between the bottom snare and the kick mic, depending on what's happening. This is kind of a rabbit hole that I don't think I should go down right now, but sometimes it's really helpful to go in and do a high pass filter, maybe starting at just 60 hertz, maybe all the way up to 80 hertz. But in short, getting rid of all that low end information kind of can fix polarity problems and make the phasing issues go away. That's another story for another day. I just wanted to throw that in there. And then I usually go over to the hi-hat. If you have a hi-hat mic, this one is really sneaky because it can really ruin a snare sound if it's not right with the top snare. So I'm going to turn this up just for the sake of the example. I'm going to reverse this. So sometimes, if this is wrong, it'll start sucking the life out of the snare drum, And you won't think, oh, it's the hi-hat mic, but it just sneakily takes away all the energy from your snare drum. So that's a good thing to be aware of. So now we've got kick, snare, overheads, and hi-hat. Let's check out the toms. This is an issue with toms as well. I've already gotten those fixed. So here we've got all the close mics. You may not have any room mics, and that's fine. Room mics are one of my favorite things, and this is what this particular room adds to the mix. Let me put it back to stereo instead of mono. There we go. Let me go ahead and show you these little bits of processing that I did on each channel. I usually start with overheads. So it looks like here I almost always cut at 80 Hertz on overheads just to get rid of some low end rumble that doesn't need to be there. It helps with the phase relationships of the kick drum. Gets rid of some low frequencies that cause problems. By the way, you don't have to have these exact plugins to be able to do this. It's more important that you just know what I'm doing rather than what plugin I'm using. I've got a tiny bit of compression on the overheads. I don't think I usually do that, but I did in this case. This is an EQ I did. Without it, it sounds like that. So I'm just adding some brightness and cutting out some mud, I think 300 Hertz, and some maybe 180 or 200 Hertz here. This particular plugin here is Slate Virtual Console Collection, a virtual channel. And basically it just emulates a big analog console. This is just a tone, kind of a tone shaper across the whole mix. Snare drum, this is the natural snare, the top mic. Added some top end, some presence around 3K, took out 800 Hertz and boosted a lot at 100 Hertz. And there is some compression going on here. One thing I want to mention about that is compression on close mics can be a risky thing depending on what material you have recorded. You should just know that the more you compress, you're bringing down the loud stuff, but you're also bringing up the quiet stuff. And that means bleed, or if you have a buzz in the line and you didn't know it. If you have lots of hi-hat bleed in the top snare mic, the more you compress that snare, the more hi-hat bleed you're going to get. So I prefer, if I do any close compression, I like to do it on a very gentle setting to catch the loudest hits, or compress the mess out of a sample that I add in that sounds like the snare beside it. And then I like to focus on the bus compression more. I do the heavy lifting for the compression with drums here instead of the close mics. That's my preference. This is a multi-band compressor and expander, and what that's doing here is adding even more presence, even more snap, and some more body and low end, but it is only triggering when the snare is hit. And the other way this plugin works is compression. So every time the signal gets above this threshold, it would actually pull down. But here on the range knob, I have it pushed up so that every time the drum gets above the threshold, it actually adds in that EQ range. This lets you keep boosting the brightness in the EQ without bringing in more hi-hat bleed. Kind of helps work with the compression. Whoops, I didn't mean to hit that. Then I added even more body and like low end with this EQ. I did it in stages. I guess I just kept wanting more and more from this particular drum. And this is a transient designer. And what a transient is, if you look at a waveform, that initial hit where there's the big wave is the transient. And this just makes that even punchier, and you can make the transient longer, the drum sustain more. Let's see what this is like without it. It's hard to hear exactly what this is doing because I used it for gain as well, but there's more punch and more sustain, just like these say. And I put those on the inside kick mic, the snare top, and the toms. Moving over to snare bottom, I added some sizzle up here at the top, and I used this to gain it down some. And then something I like to do is heavily compress the bottom snare. I personally like a lot of buzz from the rest of the kit. I feel like the bottom snare mic creates a lot of cohesion, makes the kit feel like one element. And so having the snares buzz around with all the rest of the elements is exciting to me. And this is especially helpful in builds because you've got those little quiet hits on the snare when it's at its softest. But hearing that little bit of buzz going on lets me know more easily, hey, a build is happening. I don't have to work as hard to automate the top snare mic to get loud so that you can hear the build notes. The bottom snare buzz helps you know that that's going on. Let me move over to the kick. I've got a little bit of compression going on here again. That's up to about 6 dB of compression, which again I don't usually do, but this particular drummer and this particular drum, there were some uneven notes that I wanted to smooth out a little bit and not have to compress as hard later on. I'm not knocking the drummer, by the way, that's just the way it worked. Then more snap up here, and I actually added some 300 hertz, which is another weird move from what I usually do. Usually 300 and 400 is a cut frequency for drums for me because it makes them sound crispier and less muddy. But this microphone is way, way inside the drum and close to the beater, and so I wanted to add some more body there. And like we said before, transient designer. Kick out. This was just used to flip the polarity. So this is a Pultec EQ, which is famous for adding loads of low end. So if you've never used one of these before, basically this is the frequency I've chosen, which is 60. 60 is usually the basic low end of a kick drum frequency. That's a safe bet most of the time. I've boosted that up to 10 and then also attenuated it with this knob up to about 3. It just does a cool shaping thing. It's hard to explain. I probably shouldn't try to explain it in this video, but this is adding gobs of low end and taking away some gain. Let me try to show you what it's like without the plug-in. That was it before. That's it with. So tons of low end. Then virtual console, decapitator. I love this plugin. This is saturating the sound, and then I'm blending this. Anytime you see a mix knob on a plugin, that is parallel processing without having to copy a track or anything like that. So I went all the way wet, got some crunch going on, and then I just rolled it back to about 50%. so that you've got the crunch adding harmonics and some exciting tone to the drum or whatever you're working on, but you still have 50% of the original sound, so it's not fully affected. And then this EQ is there to take out some muddiness at 200. So David, when he produced this, he added a sample that I really like to the drum, to the kick drum, and it just sounds like, basically just sounds like room mic. And this is a trick that I really like doing, especially when I don't have room mics on drums. You can use samples of just room hits and blend them in with your close mics. Sounds like this. I love that. It creates space, does exactly what I would want a real room mic to do. And even though we have this room mic here, it doesn't sound as big as this one. Let's see, hi-hat. I don't think I really did anything on this hi-hat at all other than the polarity and that, and I turned it down. I broke my own rule here with not leaving the fader at 0, but I knew I wasn't going to send the hi-hat to anything, and I was just lazy and didn't worry about it. Room mic with no processing sounded like this. But the first thing I did was took out some presence that was getting kind of harsh with the cymbals. I cut everything below 150. Virtual console. Then smashed it with a compressor. This is one of my favorite things about room mics and my favorite thing to do with room mics, and that is use an 1176 style compressor to really smash it. Brief overview, if you don't already know, 1176 has this really cool function called all buttons in mode, and in real life you actually would see these 4 buttons and you would push all of them in at the same time until they stuck, and it makes this weird, crazy response. It adds distortion. It sounds really exciting. But that's what I've done here. That's without it. And that's with it. This was a pretty conservative setting. I didn't want the cymbals to get too out of control, but it adds distortion, adds crunch. It makes the drums kind of bloom. It makes the room sound kind of bloom into the drum mix, which is always a fun thing for me. And then this is a multi-band compressor, occasionally pulling down some mud that was in the room. And these are taming big cymbal hits so that they don't get out of control and splash into the mix too much. Jumping over to some samples that I have in the snare sound. This is actually a drum sample that I made. It's from Greenbrier Drums Volume 1, which you can find on my website. I used this just to get that squashy, compressed sound. I put the sample in. I checked the polarity. By the way, you've got to check the polarity even when you bring in samples, even though they're something completely different. It will sound better one way than another way. I've already figured that out here, so I blended these together and then really smashed this with the compressor without it. It sounds like this. Very different. Adds a lot of snap and excitement. I brightened it up even more. And then this is another snare sample that I made. This was made with just a single mic on a snare with the preamp cranked all the way up, so it's really crunchy. And what that does is add lots of energy to the snare sound. Sometimes adds some low end and it's just exciting. Let's see, I did some presence boost here, and let me put all these snare mics together. And then in context with the whole kit. Let me add in these reverbs real quick so we can hear what they add. It's kind of subtle, but listen to the tail on the end of the snare hits. The decay is where the magic is happening. Right now, I don't think there's anything going on this one. You'll notice that these are blue right now, and that's because they only happen in this section of the song right here. I got a revision that asked for the snare hits in this section to just be huge, so they suddenly pop on, and they're adding that huge decay. But that wasn't necessary for the whole song. A really important thing to note up here, if you're gonna do huge reverbs, maybe even with any reverb or any effect, think about putting an EQ beforehand to cut out some low end, because that's where things get really muddy with delays and reverbs and things like that. This cuts out the mud before you even get to the reverb. So that it's kind of just a texture that's extending instead of the whole full range of the drum, because that can get muddy. I added decapitator after this reverb on both channels, and that's adding grit and distortion and kind of extending, it's kind of compressing and extending the reverb to make it even longer and more exciting. That's a fun thing to do after effects. So let me look at my list here. What is next? So I already showed you these samples, but one thing I would encourage you to do is get your drum mix as good as you can without the samples, and then blend the samples in. That helps a number of things, but one of the primary things is if you do have a song with a build in it, it's way easier to make the switch to rely on the natural drum mic during that build than to try to make a trigger have the right range to do the samples at a softer volume. Maybe you're using samples that don't have velocity adjustment or don't have dynamics to them. You don't want it to sound like a machine gun going off over and over again. So try to use the real mics if you can, the real snare and the real kick, and just use the samples to accentuate what you have going on. Let me go over to the bus processing now. On here, I have done some EQ to make it even brighter, 12.5K shelf, some presence at 3K. This move, I mentioned earlier, making adjustments in context. I was really happy with the drum mix, and then I moved on to the rest of the song. I took a break. I came back and I thought something about the drums just sounds kind of tubby or muddy. And I came in here and I just did this 180 minus 2 dB, and it cleared everything up for me. Let me take a look at this bus compressor. This is an SSL style bus compressor, which is my favorite for drum bus. Let me get over to this section of the song. Without it's a little bit subtle. It's one of those things you develop an ear for, but it's adding punch. It's making a more cohesive sound. It's adding more energy and sort of gluing everything together. Another one of my favorite things to do on drums is add these tone shapers like the tape machine, and I did more decapitator here. I blended it at about 30%, and then more virtual console, and I used that to set my gain output so that it was around 15. Over to the parallel compression over here. First, let me play without the compression. I think you just heard, but I'll play it without and then add it back in. Again, really subtle. Most of these things are subtle moves that make a really good end result, but I'm gonna solo this. I gotta set these to pre before you'll be able to hear it. Okay, so this is very quiet. Let me turn it up so that you can hear this. I did the same EQ as over here. This is the compressor I used for this particular channel. Usually I'll do another 1176, but this thing has a really exciting compressor on it. So without this, it sounded like that. For this example, let me turn this up too. That's what I'm looking for with a parallel compression track. Something exciting, kind of bouncy and buoyant and trashy. And then I just used this to blend it back so that it added just a little bit of volume. You don't really want it to add a ton of volume. You just want it to add sustain and character to what you're doing. And then I just copied these over. So again, everything together sounds like this. I think one of the reasons I may have left this parallel compression channel down a little bit is because there was a lot of bleed happening in the floor tom microphone. So every time the floor tom happened and cymbals were happening at the same time, the cymbals splashed into this channel. I guess I was a little bit scared of that coming in too much, so I think normally I would add a little bit more. But the mix is sounding good the way it is, so I don't really want to change it. Speaking of toms, I want to mention how I typically treat those. You can try to use a gate for your toms. It is possible. It can work. But most of the time, just to not have to worry about it, I go through and cut out. Let me show you the old channel. So the channel used to look like this with all of these other drums bleeding in, but I actually went in and cut out everything other than these tom hits. It's kind of a manual gate. I did that for both toms. That is sort of time consuming, but sometimes it's a toss up between, is it going to be faster to cut out everything manually or actually get a gate to work? Most of the time you would have to go in and make the gate threshold, automate, and all this stuff to make it really, really work. Sometimes I do add tom samples if there's too much cymbal bleed, especially for the floor tom. But in this case, I was able to make it work. I don't think I looked at the processing on the tom mics yet. So, typical go-to is add some presence, cut mids, and add loads of low end. In this case, for the upper tom, I did 100 shelf, and for the floor tom, I did 50 hertz, bell curve, and added 12. Usually I will also add presence here and cut mids, but this particular tom had lots of attack and kind of a scooped mids sound anyway. Then I added more decapitator. I do like saturation like this on toms, and the transient designer again. I hope I covered everything I wanted to with that. Let's look at how this is working with the bass guitar. The main key that I have found for mix after mix is that side chaining the bass drum to a compressor or a multi-band compressor on the bass guitar is a really good move to make the low end frequencies work together. So in this case, I did all these things for tone shaping on the bass guitar, but then at the very end, I put this multi-band compressor on. And if you notice, all of these frequencies here, the sidechain source is set to internal within this plugin, but this band right here says external, and up here it says bus 1 beside this key. And then if you look at the inside kick, it's being sent through bus 1 on pre-fader all the way over to this plugin. And you'll notice that this dip happens every time the kick drum happens. And that should be happening at 60 Hertz, which, like I said, is the typical place to start when you're messing with a kick drum frequency. But basically, it's just getting that frequency out of the way on the bass guitar so that every time the bass drum hits, there's room for it in the mix. This applies to all kinds of genres. If you're working with 808s and like a hip-hop mix, and you've got super sub bass going on too, this is almost imperative. Like, you can't really make the mix work without doing that and making room for all of those frequencies that are fighting. You can do this with just a normal compressor, but a normal compressor will pull down the entire volume of the entire frequency range of the bass guitar every time the kick drum hits, which can be fine. That could work. But if you have the option, it's usually nicer to pull down just the low end so that you can keep the full range of the upper bass guitar, so you can hear all the detail of if there are any runs that the bass player is doing. I also want to show you the percussion that I did. I actually programmed all of this percussion after the mix came to me. That was part of the job. And so in this particular section of the song, sounds like this. So I also knew that I was going to have these, I've got some claps and some tambourine and things going on that are accentuating the snare drum. So I also want to say that when I was mixing these drums, I took this into context as well. If you know you're going to have samples, if it's just a part of the song, or if you're going to have a lot of percussion, try to mix as much in context as you can with both elements so that you don't have to do so much backpedaling down the road. That about covers it for this video. If you have any questions, want me to elaborate on something, I would be happy to do that. Just send me an email at jarringtonmusic@gmail.com, and I'll talk to you then.